So we're now going to go over the facial bones, the bones that actually make up the face, and there are several of them. So as we talked before on the previous video, we have, of course, the nasal bone. Off to the side of the nasal bone, on either side of the nasal bone, is this bone right here. If you pinch your nose right off to the sides, this area here, this bony structure here, is known as the lacrimal bone, which if we turn it this way, you can actually see that there's a depression here called the lacrimal fossa and an opening right here called the lacrimal foramen. Behind the lacrimal bone, on the inside, if you were to go here and then go a little bit further in, this bone right here is known as the ethmoid bone. So that's what that is. So that's the ethmoid. Now, more towards the front of the lacrimal bone, this bone here coming towards the front and forming basically the upper part of the mouth, the jaw here. This part right here is actually the maxilla. So this would be the maxilla. Then above that, off to the sides, forming the cheekbone, would then be the zygomatic. Now the zygomatic actually goes back towards the temporal bone, and the zygomatic bone connects to this process right here that is coming off of the temporal bone, and this is actually called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, not to be confused with the zygomatic bone, which is here. Turn that back over this way. You can also see that here in this side of the eye is actually the sphenoid. So this would be the sphenoid here as well as here. So they're on both sides of the eye socket right there. Now, if we look inside the nose, we'll see a piece that's sticking out right here. That's called the vomer. And then inside, you actually see a piece that comes up and down that connects to the vomer, and that's the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. On either side of the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid may be shelf-like protrusions. You'll see that there's one right here, and there should be another one that's here, but it's missing on this one, and they're both missing on this side. This is actually the nasal concha. There's a middle nasal concha, and there should be an inferior nasal concha, and one at the very top that you can't see, which is the superior nasal concha. Below each nasal concha is a nasal meatus, which is depression below that. Okay. Now, if we look inside of the eye, you'll see that there are these narrow slits inside the eye known as fissures. So you have a superior orbital fissure here and an inferior orbital fissure here. Off to the side of that, deep into the eye, is a hole right here. And that opening, which I basically put the stick through, that's the optic canal right there. Okay. Now, below the zygomatic bone is another opening right here. That's the infraorbital foramen. And then above right here is the supraorbital foramen. Sometimes there's a depression, so it would be called the supraorbital notch. Now, as we move away from the eyes and nose, we come down towards the mouth, and we now have to look at the mandible. So here we actually have the mandible, where we have these knuckle-like eminences on the mandible, which would be the mandibular condyle. The sharp fin-like structure right here is known as the coronoid process. In between the mandibular condyle and the coronoid process is the mandibular notch. Below that is the mandibular ramus, and then at the corner of the jaw is the mandibular angle. So this would be the ramus, this would be the angle. As we move towards the front of the jaw, you'll see that there's an opening here towards the chin, which the chin is known as the mental, and so this is known as the mental foramen. Here we have this protrusion here on the mental, and this is known as the mandibular symphysis. The area where the teeth attach to both the mandible as well as the upper jaw here in the maxilla is known as the alveolar margin. If we turn the mandible around, we can see that there's an opening towards the back, and that is known as the mandibular foramen right there. You can see it, one on both sides, and that's what that is. Okay. Now, the teeth joined to and attached to the mandible and the maxilla through a specialized joint called a gomphosis. G-O-M-P-H P-H-O-S-E-S. So it's a specialized, freely movable joint. All right.